So, Gad, I wanted to talk to you because I guess what are we, 24 hours after, for me, it's been 24 hours because I didn't stay up all night long watching the election, but um, it's about 24 hours since waking up to the news that Trump won. And definitely, at least here in our ivory tower of a blue state in California, a huge shockwave of waking up to the fact that Donald Trump had won. And it got me thinking a little bit about othering actually and the kind of comfort bubbles that we live in. And I started thinking about that from an anthropological perspective. I started thinking about what was really going on here and a lot of the narrative kind of differences that we've created throughout the country. And so I was really excited when, because your name has been brought up a number of times to me. And when I started thinking about it, I was like, wow, here's someone who studies evolutionary psychology and how it affects us from within our consumptive culture. And I thought, man, getting you on the show and getting your perspective of not only what's gone on here and kind of what our road ahead of us looks like, but, then backing up a little bit and talking really about the work that you've done, which is so fascinating. So if that's okay with you, I'd love to jump in with that. And maybe we can start with, first, if you don't mind quickly explaining what does that mean, that evolutionary psychology meets kind of consumptive culture study framework that you have. And then, yeah, the lens of how that might be used when you look at the election would be fascinating.
Gotcha. First, thank you very much for having me on. I saw your list of wonderful guests, and I thought, because I receive, frankly, many invitations, and oftentimes if I don't know the person, I can go to their podcast to get a sense of who they are, and I thought that you were doing a wonderful job, so it's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you.
So what I basically do is I take evolutionary principles, and then I demonstrate how they manifest themselves when we put on our hats as consumers. Now, I define consumption very broadly, so it's not just the consumption of Coca-Cola and wearing jeans and Starbucks, but we also consume friendships, we consume religious narratives, we consume political campaigns, we consume mates, not in a cannibalistic sense, but in the sense of
Right.
all of the evolutionary mechanisms that cause us to choose one mate over another. And so then what I do is I say, well, of course we are cultural animals, and that's where most social scientists would agree that culture affects our behaviors. But where regrettably most social scientists have miserably failed is that they have abdicated the role of biology in explaining human behavior in general and consumer behavior in particular. And so what I basically do is I introduce evolutionary theory. I Darwinize the field of consumer behavior. So just to give you a few examples that maybe some of your viewers may or may not be familiar with. So I look at things like how does testosterone affect men when they engage in an act of conspicuous consumption. If I put you in a Porsche so that I am imbuing you with immediate social status, will there be an endocrinological response of your system akin to how we see in the animal kingdom? If two males fight, the winner has a rise in his testosterone, the loser has a drop. So that would be one example of a study I've done. On the opposite side, when it comes to, for example, female-based hormones, I've looked at things like how does the menstrual cycle affect women's consumer desires, preferences, choices. And so I looked at things like food-related consumption or beautification. So for example, women are much more likely to beautify themselves when they are ovulating, very much in line with what female mammals do in other species, right? When they're in estrus, they signal themselves. And so so the general idea is to demonstrate that the indelible forces of evolution that have shaped our minds and our bodies don't suddenly mysteriously disappear when we put on our consumer hats.
That makes sense. And so just to paraphrase a little bit so that I understand consumption, you're really meaning the way that we buy ideas in a way inside of ourselves. So when we're purchasing certain ideas, or it's not just like the actual purchase of something, but the purchasing of ideas as well.
Certainly. I mean, to the extent that for example, when you are reading my books, in a sense, you are consuming my ideas. I am parasitizing your brains with my memes. And so that's what I mean when I say that I define consumption very broadly. And this allows me then to study phenomena under the rubric of consumption using an evolutionary lens, which otherwise people would typically not link with one another.
Okay, so let's talk about the ideas that are being and not being purchased through the last electoral cycle here, through this election. So how might you be using that lens to look
Right.
at the election?
Right. Yeah. Beautiful question. So there are several ways that we could apply evolutionary theory to inform, well, political marketing and political choices in general, and then we could link it to this particular one if we want. So, for example, what are the types of attributes that people look for in political candidates itself would be under the purview of an
Hmm.
evolutionary lens. So, for example, all other things equal, we know that historically in the United States, the taller candidate has won way above chance level, right? And that's because height, all other things equal, is a cue that is interesting, that is related to dominance, right, to social status. And so things like whether you have certain facial features that are strong markers of testosterone would be things that all other things equal are attractive. Ross Perot, for those of you who might remember who he is, or Michael Dukakis, are
Right.
guys that I could have told you were unlikely to win because they didn't exude that type of dominance. So the idea is that we could use evolutionary theory to get a sense of what are the types of cues that people use, what are the types of fast and frugal heuristics that people use in deciding if someone looks presidential or not. And for those of you who might think, oh, well, this sounds very academic, but is it really truly applied? Well, if you look at how the camps of both parties will typically sit there and negotiate where the podium is going to be placed and whether you're going to show them as one being taller than the other, they certainly seem to know these Darwinian imperatives quite well. So that
That's
would,
right. I,
yeah, go
I
ahead.
had Franz Dewall on the
Sure.
show, who's a very famous primatologist. He was actually talking about this same thing about
Mm,
Trump and how alpha, how he exhibits the same kind of alpha male qualities that you would see in bonobos or chimps or apes or a lot of the different primates. So I think that very much maps to what you're talking
beautiful.
about.
Yes,
Yeah.
I very much love his work, and we're friends on Facebook.
Hmm.
But in any case, so the second way that we could apply, I mean, in part evolutionary psychology, but more generally psychology of decision making to this political decision making, is to look at the types of strategies that people use when they make decisions. So, for example, one strategy we can use is to look at all of the attributes that define each candidate, give a weight to each of the attributes, and then come up with a summation of all of the attributes in deciding whether Clinton or Trump is better as an overall candidate. This is called the weighted additive rule, meaning that you are really looking at who is the overall best package when you weigh in all of the attributes that are relevant. And in that
Okay.
case, one can make the argument that when you look at that whole package, maybe we should have expected Clinton to win. On the other hand, there are endless other decision rules that people could use that would not yield a Clinton victory. So let me give you one example. So there's a rule called the lexicographic rule, which basically says look at your most important attribute, that the most important attribute to you. So, for example, if I'm choosing toothpaste, my most important attribute might be price. The one that is the lowest price is the one that I choose. Okay. So lexicographic rule basically says look at the most important attribute for you and choose that candidate that scores better only on that attribute. That's the only thing I'm going to do. So let's suppose I am uniquely concerned with the immigration issue. In other words, I'm going to use the lexicographic rule using only how the candidates score on immigration. That's my only information that
Lever. Yeah.
exactly. Well, in that case, one could easily argue that if that's what I care about and I score Trump higher on immigration than I do Clinton, then I will choose Trump. So, in other words, there are
Right.
very, very clear, easily understandable mechanisms, decision rules, heuristics that could lead to somebody choosing Trump without being a Nazi bigot and a toothless hick who denies evolution and an irrational, Islamophobe. I know many people who are very intelligent and sophisticated, not many of them necessarily in academia, who voted for Trump. And I know for a fact that they're not card-carrying members of the Nazi Party or the KKK. So we need to be a
Right.
bit more nuanced in our thinking.
Right. So there's a kind of I guess a thing that we do as humans to survive often. I mean, to categorize things because it gives us an opportunity to not have to absorb as many of the details. So if I look at someone who voted, who had that view of, immigration, or maybe it was taxes, and that was what was really important to them, and everything else kind of went by the wayside, I might lump them and the rest of the attributes that I bring to someone who may make a decision like that to that person. So I might say, well, since you feel that way on immigration, you clearly feel that way on guns and abortion and everything else, because that's what all of you people or of the others in your category believe.
And so there is actually a class of decision rules that people use, which is very much evolutionary based. They're called fast and frugal heuristics. They're fast in that they're computationally non-costly, they're shortcuts, and they're frugal in that they're cognitively effortless, right? They don't require so much effort on my part to arrive at a choice. Well, there's very clear evolutionary arguments to be made for why, when an organism is facing all sorts of difficult decisions, that they would want to use computationally simple and fast decisions, right? If you have to sit there and maximize some utility function for 4 hours before you make a choice of where you're going to go forage for food, well, somebody's going to eat you before you end up foraging for that food, right? So fast and frugal heuristics, which were really developed by a German psychologist and his group, his name is Gerd Gigerenzer, speak exactly to what you're talking about, right? So for example, there's something called the recognition heuristic, which basically says, I choose that which I recognize. And so let me give you a great example of a manifestation of this heuristic. So if you take a bunch of stocks that you could invest in, right, companies that you could invest in, well, you could either apply an unbelievably sophisticated mathematical model to choose the optimal stock using some PhD in mathematics, or you could simply go down the list of companies and simply choose the one that which you recognize. Oh, Coca-Cola, I recognize. Ford, I recognize. And if you only use this unbelievably naive heuristic, it ends up performing as well as the phenomenally sophisticated mathematical model. So there are contexts where using these very sort of brute, simple heuristics works out. Other cases it doesn't. And so, yeah, so there you go.
That's amazing. I would love to talk to you a little bit about, because one of the things that I thought about with this election after the fact was, like, over the last 24 hours or so, was really about this. There's a phrase in Silicon Valley, which is where I'm based, that you hear now and then, and you may have heard it, but the phrase is something like, I'll probably screw this up, but it's like, in a bacon and eggs breakfast, the pigs have a lot more skin in the game than the chickens, right? Because the chickens are involved, right? Like, they're giving you an egg maybe, but the pigs are very committed to that meal. And one of the things that really struck me in the last 24 hours was when you back up from the candidates themselves and you think more about the movements that were going on socially within the country. I think that a lot of what is going on here that was resonating for a lot of people behind Trump, behind the campaign of Trump, is that government, there's this friction between government and the people, where the people feel like government are chickens. They're involved with us, but they're not really committed to us. They're not really, there's a lot more intelligence because of the internet and a lot of other things, where people out there understand, like, when it comes to health, or when it comes to finance, or when it comes to business, or it comes to all these issues, that there's a massive disconnect and kind of an out of touch quality that the people in government have versus the information that we have. For example, like they're still labeling some health bars that are made with 100% organic nuts as unhealthy for you because it has too much fat, which is a relic of the 80s or whatever, right? So I'm curious, from your perspective, where we've got this campaign where we're kind of othering so much, whether what your view of that really is, that disconnect.
So, I mean, I could speak to the disconnect between the government and the populace, as you said, but I think, where I might be able to even speak with better sort of first account perspective is the disconnect between academics and the regular people. Okay.
Yeah. That'd be great.
Which could serve as a proxy for the other discussion. Look, I mean, it is extraordinary for me to see on my Facebook wall the complete unanimity of every single academic on every possible issue. Statistically speaking, it simply can't be, right? I mean, the world is a complex world where there isn't always a clear answer as to what is the optimal fiscal policy, whether affirmative action is a good idea or not, whether the death penalty is cruel or appropriate for certain crimes, right? The natural variation across people, certainly intellectual, sophisticated, educated people, should be that we should expect some heterogeneity in their preferences, in their attitudes, in their positions. Yet, when I look at all of their positions, they are one consistent flock, one perfect herd. Not one person steps out of bounds, right? And so what happens is you create this perfect, this insular, this impenetrable echo chamber where, I mean, you want to talk about othering. I see them, these are sophisticated intellectual people saying things like, well, of course Trump won since, you know, much of the United States is made up of misogynists, racists, bigots, you know, Nazi folks. I mean, right? I mean, think about it, right? Someone can put out a tweet as an academic that is incredibly less marginalizing than that, and their career, regrettably, is almost ruined, if not ruined. Yet, people feel perfectly comfortable saying that 50+ million people are all, I mean, well, the basket of deplorables, right? They're all bigots. They're all Nazis. They're all toothless hicks from Alabama who are growing a tail because they're not quite Homo sapiens. That can't be right. That is not the discourse that a truly intelligent, nuanced person says. And so why does that happen? Well, because you never receive any feedback or pushback against your positions, because the flock walks in step. It never meets any resistance. And then comes along Saad, who doesn't walk to that step, right? Now, people usually avoid having these confrontations with me because typically they can't defend their position because it's driven by emotion, right? I mean, it's very difficult to defend a position that 50 million people are all Nazi bigots, but it feels emotionally right, right? And everybody supports me that everybody is a Nazi bigot, so I can happily exist in my echo chamber, never being unencumbered by the opinions of others.
You know, it's not uncommon to have flocks standardize their points of view, but where it's troubling, to your point, is in academics, because, you know, that's where so much shaping, you know, the responsibility of academia and in having healthy tension points is in having different voices, right? Because that's what allows you to create your own and to see different points of view. So I guess I'm not surprised on one hand that there is so much insular kind of thinking. And on the other hand, it's crazy because I got to tell you, just last night in preparing to even talk to you, and I've got a kid in college, and I started to kind of look at some of the things that you were talking about going on at universities. And it kind of, wow, it shocked me in a way. And there's always been, I think, at least in my life as a kid of the 70s and going through a lot of civil rights movements and so forth, that there's been this kind of, at least in the last, you know, I don't know, 100 years or so, a slow evolution of rights-based movements where the younger generation is trying to create this tension point with the older generation. But when I started to take a look and start and learn about triggers and safe places and micro assaults and micro insults and micro inclusions and all of these different things, I thought, what the fuck is going on here? Like, what? It's almost like an entitlement bubble that people are sticking themselves in, and that's dangerous because it creates even more of a schism when all of those people get out into culture, and then there's all the people who never were part of that discourse, and it creates even more division.
And then it creates Trump because the people who are not at Stanford and Berkeley, who don't exist in the bizarro world of safe spaces and microaggressions and trigger warnings, who live in the real world, who are Darwinian beings, who recognize competition, who recognize strife, who recognize that your boss may have different opinions from you and your coworkers may have different opinions from you, then they say, what is going on? We've had enough. Now, the government, to some extent, who it is inhabited, so to go back to your earlier point, is inhabited by people who came from Stanford and Berkeley. And therefore, they recreate that echo chamber on a grander scale. And the average common person says, I'm tired of it. I won't have it anymore. I don't want to be called a racist. I should be allowed to speak my mind without being truly marginalized, truly othered, right? Look, you know, I don't know if you saw my talk that I gave at the University of Ottawa on the thought police. I mean, what I tried to do in this talk was to sort of come up with as many examples of absolute lunacy that is happening at universities. That
I saw it.
Okay, so if I were coming up with satire, right? If Saturday Night Live hired me to come up with as wild a set of examples that are not truly real, that didn't happen, you're engaging in hyperbole to demonstrate something, I couldn't come up with stuff that is as wild as this, right?
Okay, share the MLK one.
Okay. Oh, so that's the test that you actually did watch it. So that was, I think, at the University of Oregon, where some students were triggered and bothered that Martin Luther King had not been sufficiently inclusive in his message, because while he had looked at sort of the race-based issue, he hadn't, you know, included the LGBT and the XBLTMCF1247 and so on, right? And so if Martin Luther King, as I argued in that lecture, is not safe from the ire of those folks, you better keep quiet, because nobody is safe.
You know, this is one thing that struck me too, and when you were talking about in that lecture that you gave, it reminded me a little bit of, I don't know, and I've referenced this book probably too many times on this show, and I know he's going to be a guest soon too, actually, but have you read Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens?
I don't think so. I think I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
So he, in that book, one of the great things that he did that really opened my brain up a whole bunch was talk a little bit about us as animals, as people over time, and how, well, lots of different things, but a couple of things I wanted to talk to you about, since you do study evolutionary psychology and consumption, is that, you know, the idea of rights is made up. It's a fiction, right? So the idea that there's equality among all people is bullshit, because there are people who are stronger and smarter, and there's inequality everywhere, right? But the constitutional point of view that this country has created, and it's not all countries on the planet even today. I mean, there's still countries with generalized caste systems involved with their cultures, but in this culture that we've manifested, you know, 250 years ago, you know, we created this narrative of equality being and a level playing field being the spirits have given us this God-given right to be equal. And I think we've taken, and by the way, I'm a huge fan of some of those ideas, but it is something that we've made up as animals to live within. So I think what's happened is we've almost exploded that idea into something that has taken us back to the original problem, which is othering, right? Which is this human instinct. And this is one of the other points he makes in this group, is that there's lots of species that lived at the same time that were different kinds of humans, but like Neanderthals, for example, and we would systematically just destroy them because they weren't like us, right, is the theory. So the theory is we will always other. Right. Back to categorization. So and we will always do that.
So many different possibilities to go with your lead-in. So let me try to remember a few of them. So first, let me give you a sense of why this sort of equality, where that equality narrative comes from. We should first, and then I want to talk about sort of the coalitional stuff that you talked about, the othering. So let's try to remember those two things. Look, equality under the law is a wonderful, lofty thing that you know, any classical liberal person should support. But equality under the law is oftentimes conflated with equal potentiality and equality of outcomes, right? This is exactly what happens with radical feminists, right? Because they wish to have equality of the sexes, which any liberal should support. I certainly support that. Then they think that if you offer a scientific narrative that argues that men and women might have some innate differences, then that helps in promoting the, quote, sexist status quo. So therefore, they confuse indistinguishable under nature as being equal but different under nature, right? Men and women are different. Our species is referred to as a sexually dimorphic species. No biologist contests that. We're defined as such. Therefore, by definition, we have innate sex differences. Yet, of course, that doesn't mean that men or women should be systematically discriminated against in a liberal and just society. So that's one of the first problems that you see. Now, where does this sort of equipotentiality come from? It comes from a view of the human mind that is profoundly idiotic, which is basically the tabula rasa perspective, the mind as an empty slate, right? So the argument is that the thing that made Sam and Gad different, because when we were born, we were exactly equal. It's that our unique socialization, our unique environmental experiences that then shaped us into taking the different trajectories that we've had. Now, that's a very hopeful message, because on the one hand, it promises that, hey, we could all be Michael Jordan, we could all be Lionel Messi, and we could all be Albert Einstein if only the right socialization forces and the right environmental inputs are provided to us. So that's a hopeful message, but it's an idiotic message that only a buffoon could argue, right? Of course we are products of our socialization. Of course our unique personhoods are shaped by unique environmental realities that we face, but we also have biological blueprints that makes it such that Michael Jordan was endowed with a unique set of skills that I could have never overcome to become Michael Jordan, if only because he's much taller than me. And no amount of socialization could have fixed that. So the problem, going back to the first question you asked me about what do I do with my research, this comes from social scientists who were desperate to eradicate biology from the discussion. So, for example, cultural anthropologists argued that there is no such thing as human universals. There's no such thing as human nature. Every culture has to be looked in its own idiosyncratic bubble, and to talk about instincts and human nature is laughable. Well, I mean, an average 2-year-old knows that that's false, right? An average 2-year-old starts to categorize things in a binary way as male or female. So that's the first problem. So we should be equal under the law, but we're not all equal in our capacities. Some work harder, some are more lazy, some are taller, some have green eyes. Regarding your coalitional point, the othering, the tribal thing, I talk about this in my books, and that's really the idea that there is an innate mechanism, a computational system in our brain that is very sort of tribal in the manner in which it views the world. It's us versus them. Let me give you a great example of that. So I'm Jewish. I'm not sure if you are or not, but
I am Jewish.
There you go. The reason I'm saying this will be evident in a second. So at one point, I used to live in a neighborhood in Montreal that was, full of Hasidic people, right? Or ultra-Orthodox Jews. I mean, I wasn't one of them, but they were. Now, you would think when you see all these guys that, if anything, they are all part of one tribe. I mean, not only are they Jews, not only are they religious and conservative, they're ultra-Orthodox Hasidic, so they're all the same. Well, guess what? In its infinite capacity to ever delineate us versus them, they had a rule whereby, the Polish ultra-Orthodox did not ever allow their daughters to marry those heathen pigs from Hungary. Okay? So even within the context of an incredibly rarefied and pure group as ultra-Orthodox Jews, people still found a way to create us versus them. So regrettably, I think this is part of the indelible marks of our brains.
Yeah, and it's funny because back to categorization, it takes too much gasoline in our brain to get into those details. So the natural, capacity, the natural tendency of people is to just simplify things, because imagine what the world would be like unless in any other situation. And the narrative, though, that going back to what you said, that differences are dangerous from this kind of hyper liberal point of view, is right in the face of the fact that there are differences in the world, and we need to understand that that's okay, right? Like that's and celebrate those things, and realize, like you said, that look, laws are there in order to protect hate from happening and injustice from happening, but that to have a conversation with the language police, as you put it, where we are sequestering the ideas that we have inside of us because we can't get them out because we're so fucking wrapped up with offending, this culture of offense. So I'd be curious, from your point of view, like how does this limit this free change of ideas? Because if so many of these people are going through college and then ending up either in government or in society, and then you've got a whole other chunk of the population who do not have that experience, where does the future look? What does the future look like, and how do we get around this? America is a free speech country.
Well, frankly, it leads to downstream products called people who are lobotomized. That's the best way I could put it. They have been not surgically lobotomized, but they have been lobotomized by an educational system that exactly does what you're saying, which is shackles them so much that they are afraid to utter a single syllable that might prove to be politically incorrect and hence cause offense to somebody. Look, ideas are judged on their veracity, right? So think about in mathematical logic, right? You have a mathematical statement that then could be ascribed a value of true or false, binary, 0 or 1, right? It doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about your offense. So when you and I are discussing ideas, while we wish to be polite to each other and respectful and courteous, ultimately, if I'm trying to convince you of a point and you're trying to do the opposite with me, the same thing with me, then we present all of our evidence and then let the best idea win. That's what the scientific method does. So I don't care whether the facts that I give you will cause you offense if my goal is to demonstrate to you that my position is the vertical one. So the problem is that what is the objective function that you're trying to maximize? If the objective function is don't offend anybody, then you're going to end up with a different educational system than if the goal is teach people how to critically think, defend their positions, and so on. So we went from believing in the latter to going to the former. Now, look, let's take an example going back to are all things equal and so on. All cultures are not equal, right? In the same way that all humans are not equal. Some are taller, some are thinner, some are fatter, some are harder working. The idea, though, is that, who are we to judge cultures, right? Who are we to judge whether these particular people cut off the clitorises of their women? Who are we to judge if these folks take child brides while we don't? Well, if you've got a functioning brain, then you recognize that there are certain moral imperatives that are either correct or incorrect. So we can agree that there are absolute moral standards. Child abuse should not be tolerated, even though in your exotic culture somewhere it might be tolerated. Or at least it's not tolerated if you wish to be a member of my society. And I have a right to say, if you wish to adhere by those values, then you are not welcome in my society. It shouldn't take so much courage to state this profoundly obvious statement, right? If you come to my house as a guest, but you'd like to rape my children, you're not welcome as my guest, right? I'm not drawing a comparison between rape and certain culture. I'm just giving a separate example, right? If you are not a nice person who hurls racist insults, I have a right to choose to not be your friend. So in the same way that we make these decisions every day as to who can come into our house, who we're friends with or not, why can't we, by the same logic, decide that we only let in people into our country, irrespective of their religion, color, anything, as long as they adhere to our values? Well, what stops us from saying that is the ideology that came out of all the ivory tower that says that cultural and moral relativism is a lofty thing to believe in, because otherwise we are engaging in hegemonic imperialism with our cultural values. Bullshit, right? You can't abuse children, you can't harm women, you can't throw gays off buildings, and those are our values. And if you don't like them, you're not welcome here. If you do like them, come on in, my brother, right? So this should be so trivially easy to navigate across, but we can't because we've been so parasitized in our brains by political correctness.
So is there a way around this? Because it feels like that and maybe what we just saw happen in the election is actually people, back to this beginning part of the conversation. They're just kind of going, look, everything that you people in that tower are saying does not make sense to us. We're looking for a way. I mean, all this like grab 'em by the pussy and all the things that Trump said, which are very insulting. There's a lot of people that I talked to that were like, well, look, man, that's just the way, look, I get it. And I don't think that's the right behavior in reality, but people talk shit all the time. And, and we should really be a nation of people that can just say what you want to say, as long as it's, as long as it's not illegal. You should be able to just kind of voice whatever it is that you're thinking. You can make fun of people if you want to, or whatever. Not that I agree with that, which I oftentimes don't. But, I just wonder if what we're seeing is a little bit of a pushback of decades of holding back a voice, a certain voice that lives inside of us that we're thinking but not saying, and it's just kind of like we've put pressure on the water balloon and it's bulging out on the other side.
Absolutely. Look, there are two types of warriors. Social justice warriors are not real warriors. They're castrated folks. Real warriors come in two varieties. There's the Navy SEALs, the physical warrior, and then there's the intellectual warrior, right? Christopher Hitchens is a intellectual warrior. When he goes into battle, you better come prepared, or else he's taking no prisoners, right? Now, what we need to do is teach people that is a lofty thing to aspire to. Now, always being polite, always being respectful, not insulting, but the idea that I should have the self-confidence to be able to express myself fully, that no ideas are beyond mocking or ridiculing or scrutiny or exposure, the fact that there is no such thing as, but this might cause offense, that I don't care about this. I don't care if you're saddened by my position, or that you're disappointed by my position, or you are offended, right? If you have a better position, present to me your cogent arguments. So to answer your question, what needs to happen is there has to be a complete overhaul in the zeitgeist of our culture, right? And Donald Trump represents that, whether we like it or not. I've long argued that there will be at some point, not to sound prophetic, somebody who comes along. I didn't know whether it was going to be Trump or somebody else, who's going to be cataclysmic. He's going to have to introduce a discontinuous change, to use that parlance, right? Hillary Clinton did not represent that. Hillary Clinton could not be any more the representation of the incestuous bullshit that we're talking about, right? She is the queen of that, right? So, and that doesn't mean, by the way, that me saying that I support Trump and not Clinton. I'm just honest, right? So by the same token that Trump is now going to be occupying the White House, there has to be a similar cataclysmic shift in our educational system, so that folks like, if I may be so modest as to say, like me, are cloned in many forms, so that we become not the small, courageous minority, but the normal representation of what it is to be an academic. Somebody who is bold, who's courageous, who pursues the truth unencumbered by political correctness. And that's how you then imprint those values on your students. And then hopefully they also become courageous warriors for the truth. God damn,
let's go.
I should be prime minister. God damn.
No kidding. I'm voting for you next year. So, I just had Wim Hof on the show.
Right.
This past week. He is, for those of you who do not have not heard that or are not familiar with Wim Hof, he is someone who subjects himself to extreme discomfort and can do pretty much superhuman things. Swim underwater in under ice water for very long periods of time, be submerged in ice for almost a couple hours, hike up mountains like in his underwear or whatever. And he can moderate his internal temperature through being in that duress, and also breathing differently, changing the alkalinity of his blood, etc. Anyway, my point is that our conversation was all about getting out of the bubble in order to grow, in order to find yourself in a place where you're evolving beyond your current state, right? And education is a standardization process. And many times, like you said, it's gotten almost to the extreme standardization where now points of view are standardized, classes are standardized, the people on the other side of it become standardized. And so I really love this idea. You're almost talking about the sperm competition of ideas.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Let me draw another medical analogy, and it's not mine, but it's so brilliant that I wish I had come up with it. There's a gentleman, a neuropsychiatrist, who's gotten in touch with me, who proposed the following sort of analogy. So if you look at children who have either been exposed to allergens in their childhood or not, or if they've grown up in a very sterile environment, that predicts whether they develop respiratory problems like asthma. And the idea being that if they've been exposed to allergens, actually that triggers their immune system to eventually then downstream respond properly to asthma. If you grow up in too sterile an environment, if you have a mother or father who was OCD about cleaning everything so that every time you're walking into your house, it's a hospital room, you're more likely to develop respiratory problems. Now, he took this idea, which comes from evolutionary medicine, and he applied it brilliantly. He analogized it to the safe spaces that we're seeing on campuses, right? So you create a sterile echo chamber, as we were talking, where these kids are absolutely not exposed to any allergens, where the allergens are called other ideas, and therefore you end up with people who suffer from acute asthma, or in this case, they're lobotomized, right? And so that's what we need to do, is mix it up. The university is not a safe space. It's not a hospital room. It's a place where we go and debate all ideas, and we develop the set of skills that helps us weed which idea is good and which idea is bad. And if we don't do that, then we are violating the first principle, the raison d'être, the objective of what it is to be an educated person.
Well, look, I mean, whether it's education or it's just like you were saying, the Hasidic Jews, or it's me and my little social group, we all are guilty of not building a bridge or spending any time in any other group, right? Like the people who talk so much about equality and so much about fiscal reappropriation of funds, so there's less of this division going on. Really, only then they go back to jump in their Tesla and go to their super expensive house, and they don't actually spend. They don't really do the things that they're talking about, short of maybe paying the taxes differently.
Right.
So we all are guilty of this, right? We all in universities. There's no invitation of bringing people who aren't going into college into that classroom and to have conversations with them about these topics either, right?
Right, true. But I say some of us are less guilty of it than others. And so sort of to link what you're saying to sort of my quest for public outreach, I've often chastised my colleagues for living in their academic bubbles, not only in the context of what we're talking about, but even in terms of their professional pursuits. So for example, most of them are, very good academics. They publish in the journals that they've been trained to publish in. And of course, we all have to do that as scientists. I mean, we're mandated to advance knowledge. But what they forget is that there's another part of your mandate as an academic, as a scientist, as a public intellectual, and that is to get out there, build bridges with the public, and weigh in on important issues. If you don't want to weigh in on important issues, then at least popularize the science that you do, right? If you're doing truly interesting stuff, people want to hear about it. If you live in a country like Canada, where my salary is literally paid by taxpayer money, then I owe the public to get out there and share whatever positions that I have with them. And so you're right that many people suffer from that, and none more so than academics who feel perfectly comfortable writing an academic paper that will be read by the editor, the 2 reviewers, and their mom. And that's where it ends. And then that paper languishes for the next 600 years with people completely uninterested in it. Well, why don't you have the courage to get out, and if Sam Lawrence contacts you to come on his show, make some time to appear on the show, because maybe our show will be watched by a few thousand people, and that's a wonderful way for us to share our ideas. So one of the things that I try to do, and I'm starting to see some sort of hopeful changes where universities are now starting to try to institute reward metrics that recognize this outreach, right? Until very recently, I mean, you could be the most famous scientist in the public, and that's not going to advance you in any way in terms of your academic career. I mean, sure, you're famous, but it doesn't result in literal perks. Your salary doesn't go up. Your teaching load doesn't go down. Well, now universities are starting to recognize, hey, we need to be relevant. The public has to care about what we do. And so now they're starting to encourage that which I've been doing for many years.
Well, the world needs bigger inoculations, and so does academics and everything, of more Saad's point of view here, because I couldn't agree with you more. I'm super thankful that you said yes to being on the show, just like you said. And I love the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for being on Grow Big Always.
Thank you. A real pleasure. Thank you for having me.